I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an institute, as I hope people know by now, dedicated to the pursuit of restraint and prudence in US foreign and security policy. Before introducing today's speaker, just wanted to flag some upcoming events. On Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. EST, we have a webinar on the Epstein files, a book, a roadmap of post-Cold War corruption. And next week, on March the 2nd, at midday EST, we have a conversation on the Trump doctrine. And on March the 3rd, at 12 o'clock, we have a talk with Robert Malley on the US, Palestine, and US complicity. So I hope you will be able to attend those. By the way, also, if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to pass on as many as I can to our speaker. So today, it's a very great pleasure to introduce Georgios Varouxakis. He is Professor of History at Queen Mary University in London, and where he is co-director of the Centre for the Study of History, of the History of Political Thought. Dr. Varouxakis grew up in Crete, and has a PhD in history from UCL. He's the author of several books on political theory, including Liberty Abroad, J.S. Mill on International Relations, and Victorian Political Thought on France and the French. Today, we are going to discuss his latest book, The West, The History of an Idea, which I can say without false flattery is really one of the most interesting that I've read for a very long time. It is also, of course, one of the most timely at a time when we see ideas of the West, what is the West, of Western civilization, being mobilized not just externally against real or supposed threats to the West from outside, as with Russia, but also internally by both of the main political wings of our societies against each other. So, Georgios, welcome. It's great to have you here. So, to begin with, I would like to ask, because in your preface you talk a bit about your family background on Crete and how this gave you insights into overlapping and conflicting identities within the same society and the same person. Could you talk to us a little about that?
Thanks. Yeah, well, inevitably, even a look at the map will remind one that Crete is between three continents and at the very southeastern edge of Europe. I was baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church, which means Eastern Orthodox Church, Eastern Church. The Eastern Roman Empire, or better known now as Byzantine Empire, ended up speaking Greek for most of its life. So the Greeks see themselves as part of its tradition. So in very important senses, it's very much part of some East. On the other hand, one grows up learning that Greece is quintessentially part of the West, actually the ancestor of the West because of ancient Greece and its tradition and heritage. So, and both things are correct, of course, depending on how selectively or non-selectively you read history. So I was bound to be interested in the subject. And as I was growing up, and I was 7.5 during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974, and my father was mobilized and I needed to understand what's going on, I started watching the news and reading newspapers. And Mr. Konstantinos Karamanlis, who came back from exile in Paris to put some order in a chaotic collapse of the junta, of the military dictatorship, started saying, we belong to the West. Very insistently and repeatedly. And of course, one does not repeat something so explicitly if it's not contested. It was contested by the opposition parties. That's why he had to insist on it. So that's the beginning of the story, yeah.
And of course, at that time, and less so today, as you say, but at that time, institutionally, Turkey and Greece, but Turkey was a member of NATO. And therefore, in some technical sense, against the Soviet Union, at least, was part of the West, right? So one part of the West invaded another part of the West.
Yes, that's right. Perhaps that's why Karamanlis tried to define his terms, and in 76 he used a number of adjectives to define that in every possible sense Greece is Western, perhaps in order to differentiate from countries like Japan or Turkey that were parts of the West in the political and military sense and economic sense. So yeah, there is constantly, there was then, there was before, there is today, as you said, there will be in the future, I predict, with some certainty, constantly a contest who owns these terms and who can make use of them to promote their argument or themselves vis-a-vis others, because they are very attractive and very sufficiently vague and open to interpretation, unless we're very careful and very historically minded and nuanced, which is what is missing from most discussions, of course, that they can be used by all sorts of sides to all sorts of purposes.
And in the Orthodox world, I don't know how much in Greece still, but certainly in Russia, the fact that for considerable periods in the Middle Ages, Western Latin Christendom defined the East as the Orthodox. And of course, well, in at least one notorious episode, attacked and largely destroyed it. Is that still remembered in Greece?
To the extent that anything is remembered, unfortunately, as you know, in every society, there are very few people who bother about the past and history. I am sure in ecclesiastical circles, it's not only remembered, but resented. But most people have very short memories. I wish they remembered the 1970s that I remember, let alone 1204 that you are referring to. Yeah, it's a complicated story. But you're reminding me the ambassador of the Kingdom of Savoy in St. Petersburg for 14 years, Joseph de Maistre, Catholic, conservative, intellectual, philosopher, and diplomat, who extremely interestingly, he finished a book, Du Pape, on the Pope in 1817, while still in St. Petersburg. It was published 2 years later after he had left. But already in 1817, he was writing, we all know the Greeks are up to something. Obviously, the Greek Revolution was prepared in Russia and Odessa. It's well known. So he was sufficiently aware something is building up. And he dedicated the fourth part of the book to the Greeks, to the Orthodox Church and to how heretics they are and so on. And it's fascinating there how he treats with he's very aggressive to the Greeks and to the Orthodox more generally. But meanwhile, he's also offering a carrot, and he says, okay, everybody tells us about Pericles and Thucydides and the great people of antiquity. Let's deal with that part of Greece, the European part of Greece, the ancient Greek part of Greece, and let's leave Byzantium and the paraphernalia. So already before it existed, Greece was invited to join the West on certain terms defined by, for example, de Maistre. It's a fascinating story that many enlargements and many peripheral countries have faced and are facing when they join the EU and are told these are the rules and so on, things that we all notice. So it's a long story, definitely.
Well, and one of the problems about people, including supposedly well-informed people, not knowing history, is that they will then use terms like the West. To use an academic phrase, they will reify them. They will treat them as if they were permanent, objective realities, rather than frequently shifting ideological and geopolitical formulas. Could you tell us something about the way in which this idea of the West, or the presentation of the idea of the West, has changed over the past 200 years?
Absolutely, yes, brilliant. So obviously, as you know extremely well, first of all, people don't treat the West as if it's 200 years old as an idea, as I claim, but they think it comes from ancient Greece and all sorts of things. All this, of course, is should be taken with a lot of salt. I'm not claiming that the West, as it is today and as it has emerged in the last 2 centuries, has not been profoundly influenced by ancient Greece and Rome. Far from it. But this is what's the word? These are the ancestors of the West. This is a tradition co-opted by people in the West, correctly, in my opinion. I like it. that they co-opted it, but it's not exactly that they back then had the same identity or self-perception. So they saw themselves as the Greeks, the Romans, then Christendom, then Europe. When the West emerges as a distinctive identity in order to differentiate somebody from Europe, it was in order for West Europeans to say, Russia is not part of us. They were worried about Russia after the Napoleonic Wars. I show that with a lot of evidence that it was actually already during the Greek Revolution that some people in France started saying the problem is Russia because it was well known that Russia was coveting Constantinople. Nobody was worried about the Ottoman Empire, which was moribund and kept artificially alive by the great powers, but what would succeed? So they started talking about Greece joining the West as a rampart of the West in terms of defending itself from dangers further east and so on. So enlargement happened. It was enlarging the so-called West was coeval with its very invention, with its very existence. So the countries that saw themselves as part of the same historical process since Charlemagne, since Karl the Grosse, the Latin and Germanic nations of Europe, the mixture of the previous Roman Empire and the Germanic invaders that Gibbon had discussed as building modern Europe, these peoples immediately opened up to little Greece because they thought they needed enlargement. More fascinating, and I fear, I know we don't have much time to go into details, more fascinating is Auguste Comte, who comes in the 1840s and obsessively promotes this new name because he thinks Europe is a confusing name. And he builds a whole narrative and the whole history and the whole future project on the West, the Western Republic, as he calls it. And he immediately also opens up, although he's very, very explicit, these five great nations, the Germanic, the English, the Italians, the Iberians, and the French are the West. And they have a common history since 1800 Charlemagne, since the 8th century. He also immediately says, but we have to accept two countries from Eastern Europe for various reasons. One is Poland, because although Eastern Europe, Eastern geographically and Slavic in origins, it's been Catholic for 1,000 years, so it's part of the same culture. And Greece, which had just been independent 10 years earlier, because of the importance of ancient Greece for Rome, which was very important for the West's history. So I hope I'm answering the question. I don't want to take it too far, but the idea exactly, there is no essence. There was a core, obviously, but that core, from its very self-perception, started thinking in terms of enlargement, in terms of incorporating other countries. And so it's a very malleable concept. It's been receiving new members. It's been redefining itself. That's why there are all these confusions. As you have honored me with reading the book, I know you know I discuss all the different definitions, which we have no time to discuss here, but they have been bewildering. Yeah.
But of course, in geopolitical terms, but also internal political terms, there is something a little odd about this, because these ideas emerged in modern history shortly after a whole series of European wars, in which, in fact, France, at least as far as the French are concerned, always the core of any idea of the West and of Europe, was at war with virtually all the other European states put together. And at the same time, of course, you had these European states, and then followed, well, certainly in the case of de Maistre, for example, but France for the first 15 years after Napoleon, seeing in many ways their greatest enemy as internal, the revolution. So there must be something pretty powerful in this idea that it, and then of course in the 20th century, you have two European civil wars, with Russia ranged with France and Britain against Germany. And in the Second World War, of course, Germany has perhaps the most radically anti-Western European Enlightenment, but also anti-Christian ideology ever developed. And yet, the West keeps coming back as a concept.
Yes, yes, and explicitly anti-Western. The Nazis. There is the very interesting book by Aurel Colnay, who cited all the statements of the Nazis and all the professors who supported them. It was explicitly anti-West. It was a war against the West, as he called it. Yes, membership changes, redefinitions happen all the time. It's a constant process of becoming, and it's a constant readjustment, because that's my argument. Many academics living in the university a little bit too much propose to abolish terms like the West because it's vague or because it has been used for the wrong reasons. And the reply, of course, has to be, my humble reply is, who are we to abolish any term? The term is going to be used because it's very attractive to various political actors. So instead of trying to abolish it and not wanting to touch it because the wrong people have used it from time to time, which, by the way, has been the case with every attractive term, which is being redescribed, and revaluation of values is constantly happening every time somebody wants to win a political argument. Instead of trying to abolish terms because they are not pure enough, one should try to study its genealogy and the different uses there have been, and of course try to redefine it for the future according to one's wishes for the future.
Yes, I mean, it is awfully, it trips easily off the tongue, the West, whereas I was amused by your account of how Francis Lieber, as he's called in America, attempted to introduce the term cis-Caucasian. I'm rather glad that we don't have to get our tongues around cis-Caucasian as the phrase.
Absolutely, but do we have 1 minute to comment on this? I'm very glad you mentioned it, because it is, of course, exactly the proof of what I'm trying to say. Even Kant, who was not the most attuned, the person most attuned to the world, he was quite reclusive, and he was not reading other people's works in order for his system not to be contaminated for a few years. He called it hygiène cérébrale. Even Kant was much more clever politically and down to earth by choosing a historical term that had a very long history, emotive, religious, cultural, historical associations, and proposing it after many years of trying to decide which term to use for his new entity. He called it Europe, but he had expressed doubts already in the 1820s. Even Kant proved much more down to earth, exactly because he chose a term that could catch up, that could attract people's attention, that had some meaning to which he could add his redefinitions. Whereas cis-Caucasian, as much as it was geographically more logical, was a professor's invention, as you correctly reminded us. Yeah.
Well, we have a question from the audience, which is, of course, also rather depressing. But does, not just the idea of the West, but does the idea of civilization itself perhaps always require an other to define itself, a barbarian other to define itself against? Is that in some way inherent to the idea of the West and inherent to maybe even formulations of civilization?
Brilliant. Yes, it's a very good question. The answer doesn't have to be depressing, though. When people talked of one civilization, and they took for granted that they were civilization and everybody else was barbarian, which unfortunately happened a lot in the 19th century in Europe with most people, not all, but the vast majority of people, for a few decades at least, then of course it meant that. And there was nothing new to that. In China, I'm not pretending to be a specialist, but we all have heard of the notion of Tianxia. They are under the sky and everybody else is barbarian on all sides. The ancient Greeks called everybody from east, west, north, and south barbarian. So it's clearly a human frailty to think that one's own ways are better and everybody else doesn't make sense. But once the idea of civilizations with S, the idea of a plurality of civilizations, the idea of potentially different civilizations having existed or coexisting is taken into account, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. And for example, the French Indologist that ended up in Cairo becoming a Sufi convert, a Muslim convert and a Sufi, René Guénon, I cannot pronounce his Arabic name once he became a Sufi, but he was a major character in defending traditional civilizations and traditional religions. And he was adamant there is nothing wrong with Western civilization up to recently. It was one of several. The problem is when in modernity it wants to abolish all the others. So to that extent, that version of Western civilization that saw all other civilizations as not worth preserving or even talking about, obviously that's a problem. But it's not necessarily the only definition. And of course, there has been so much self-criticism in the West of that way of thinking that we are now in danger of going to the other extreme and thinking that's all there has been, whereas it has been a long conversation, and thankfully we don't talk of other people that way anymore, I hope.
Yes, I mean, that was my disagreement with Edward Said. I thought that his Orientalist theory made excellent sense when it came to the specific issue of Zionism and Palestine, where the denigration, if you will, of the Palestinians, or even the attempt to abolish their identity, was critical to a concrete and practical political project. But for me, he missed the fact that so many of his Orientalists actually loved the other civilizations they were studying, and were in many ways actually in revolt against what they saw as the drabness and uniformity and rampant individualism and materialism of Western culture.
Exactly, very much so. The degree to which German Orientalism, which was the most important and the most developed, was in admiration of the East and tried to was positive to the East, has been missed by Said, unfortunately. The work of Suzanne Marchand, continuing work on that on German Orientalism, but also others, of course, is very, very revealing in that respect. Exactly, it was not a black and white picture at all.
But, I mean, more recently, and especially perhaps after the end of the Cold War and the end of history, you did have this mood in the West that there was one version of civilization. I mean, of course, they didn't call it that, but when you had Tony Blair, for example, saying that throughout history, peoples everywhere have always understood freedom in the same way. I mean, what he meant was there is only one version of a good, at least, well, no, not just a political society, also a cultural society, and it's mine. It's ours. I mean, I was very struck as a journalist in Russia in the 1990s, and quite appalled, I must say, about how, well, in this case, it was either the West or Europe was used as an absolutely deliberate synonym for civilization. And by the same token, when not just Westerners in Russia, but Westernizing Russian intellectuals used the phrase Asiatic, they did mean barbarian. They meant savage, something that had to be got away from.
Yeah, there is. That's definitely the case, and it's unfortunately almost always the case in peripheral countries which do not have the complete self-confidence of countries that feel they're in the core, where they try to differentiate themselves from somebody else. When you're looked down upon by somebody, you try to look down upon somebody else in order to feel you're part of the club. That hierarchical way of thinking is very, very sad and very, very counterproductive and very unfair and very historically problematic. And we should all look at all the situations in a balanced, nuanced way and see that human nature is what it is, since Thucydides described it so long ago. And we should avoid certain situations like civil wars and so on, because when we get there, people will behave exactly in the same way as in Corcyra when he described. Absolutely correct. Yes, I agree. So, of course, since the end of the Cold War, you're right, especially that fatal decade of the 1990s, there was too much complacency and triumphalism. And Francis Fukuyama has not helped there with his end of history. Obviously, he was much more subtle than the title, but most people read the title and the first pages and didn't read the many qualifications that he himself put to his theory, and that has done an awful lot of damage. As you know, his former teacher was much more to the point and much more intelligent, much more realistic. Samuel Huntington, who immediately wrote criticizing him and then wrote articles and books where he tried to say no. And he's been very misunderstood because, of course, he didn't propose clash of civilizations. He warned that it's likely and that therefore the Westerners have to stop being hubristically assuming that everybody wants to become like them. They have to understand there are other civilizations that will be more and more assertive and powerful to assert themselves. And the Westerners should show some humility in trying to understand them. He insisted on that, as well as try to defend their own culture, which might be in danger if they assume everybody wants to become like us. He was right in all that. Where he was not right was in his immense emphasis on religion. He thought your religion somehow is your fate, and he did not abide by his own theoretical statement that peoples can change civilization, can choose collectively, obviously not in a day, but in decades, to move to a different direction. That he stated theoretically, but in practice, in all his descriptions, he was speaking in a kind of deterministic way. You have been orthodox, that's it. You will never have liberal democracy, which I refuse to accept for reasons to do with my citizenship. And I think Greece, with all its enormous problems, and I voted with my feet, I don't live there, but Greece has a functioning, healthy democracy. It has many problems, but it's a democracy, and it was a democracy since 1864, people forget, with various coups and various little dictatorships here and there. But so this idea that your religion predetermines your future in every way, I find the problem of his theory. But he was, if we have to choose, I prefer him to Fukuyama in terms of predictions, of course.
Yes, where Huntington also went wrong, I think, was in seeing these civilizations as in some way also tight geopolitical blocks, whereas actually we can see, alliances, as was always true in history, go back to Spain of El Cid actually fighting for the Muslims for a large part of his life, but also what we may see today is more what's been called state civilizations. That's to say, particular states or particular regimes within states. And I'm not saying that this is wholly, cynical or invented, but they exploit and develop the idea of civilization as a means of consolidating their state, their version of the state, and their regime. Narendra Modi certainly, I mean, even if, well, or take Xi Jinping, I mean, if there were such a thing as a cynic civilization extending across the Far East, Xi Jinping is not going to dilute Chinese sovereignty by sharing it with Japan, Vietnam, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we have more and more civilizational states of a certain size, of course, not quite large states like the ones you mentioned, that use the civilization argument in order to consolidate a nation state, and to avoid vociferous forces and so on. And it suits them very well to have a clash of civilizations. The more they can present somebody as being dangerous to them, the West, and the more the West falls into the trap, or some people in the West, the more they can say, you see, we're in danger, therefore follow the government. Yes, absolutely.
And also, of course, those countries which, for one reason or another, are not being allowed to join the West when quite a lot of them, or previous regimes, or the same regime in a previous incarnation, wanted to. I would say that was true of Russia, for example. Then, having been rejected, as it were, almost have to turn to the idea that they're a separate civilization, even if this is a deeply, actually flawed understanding of themselves. But you could say they have little choice in the matter if they're not, if they're not to accept the designation of themselves as barbarians.
Yes, absolutely. You are touching an extremely important point here. You know much more about it than I because you have had the experiences, been there. But the 90s were crucial in this respect. The way things could have been very different, very, very true. And similar things could be said of Turkey. I mean, Kemal Atatürk's project and the project of his intellectuals and his predecessors, the Young Turks. By the way, we talked about Auguste Comte. Some of the major intellectual influence on the Young Turks and then some of Kemal's major intellectuals was Auguste Comte and positivism. And some of them were in Paris writing articles on the Revue Occidentale of the positivists. So as Huntington calls them, Russia and Turkey are split countries. They are countries that could go either way. So one can imagine future constellations and future leadership choices and future rhetorical ways of dealing with these things where they could be seen very much as part of the West, yes, or could have been in the past, roads not taken, yes. And that's why I keep insisting on the malleability of the idea and on the idea that in its inception, it was much more open to enlargement and to including peoples and nations and states and countries that are not ethnically or religiously homogeneous. So the attempts by some people in reaction to some other people who are going to other extremes, as you implied in the beginning, to define Western civilization as purely Christian and purely white or Nordic are extremely counterproductive, historically more than problematic, and dangerous. And they reinforce the other extreme. They are reinforcing the false perception of academics and post-colonial scholars and so on, who assume the West and Western civilization is interchangeable with white supremacism. This is historically false, problematic, but if you hear the rhetoric of the current American administration, you might think, oh, we were right all along, except the current American administration doesn't necessarily represent Western civilization. They are self-appointed defenders. And the way they are talking about the Europeans as being betraying Western civilization and so on is ridiculous.
Well, but not all the Europeans. I mean, if Vance and company are not actually, or they would not say, or if you read Rubio's latest speech, that they are against Europe. They are against the existing European establishments, but they are on the side, of course, of the European New Right, which agrees with them on the subject of Western civilization. I mean, how dangerous for you is this deep, at least intellectual and cultural, but also to a considerable degree political now, split within the West on the one hand, I mean, an idea that, ideas that are very much hostile to any idea of the West as a valid thought or idea. And on the other, have an appallingly narrow and chauvinist version of what the West is.
Very good. First of all, we're talking on a day when I heard on the news on the BBC today that the Reform Party, Mr. Farage's party, announced today that it's going to defend the Christian identity of Britain if it comes to power. And the announcement was made by its spokesman for Home Shadow Secretary, who is a Muslim.
Yes.
Which shows you how ridiculous the whole thing is and how, unless we're careful, we're between ridiculous and heading for civil war throughout the West. What we need is a redefinition or a reassertion of what the West means for our time, which in the last few decades has meant a liberal democracy, a a pluralism which is based on certain values and certain ideas, a certain narrative. What did Crèvecoeur called it in America? The creed, the creed
American
that
creed.
America, the American creed, which Arthur Schlesinger Jr. tried to revive in 1992, and nobody liked what he was saying, and so on. We live in diverse societies. These societies will not and cannot and should not, but more importantly, forget what I think on what ought to be. They are diverse. You cannot go back to a Britain or a Europe or an America that is Nordic, Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic. Good luck. So if you define the society as such, it's a recipe for civil war, sadly. Meanwhile, the people who say, therefore, the West has to be rejected, Western civilization has to be rejected, what do they mean? Do they mean the very principles according to which we have been coexisting and building our societies? No, it has to be seen historically, it has to be reasserted as a recent development on the basis of the interaction of these societies and of how people within them and outside reacted to previous mistakes, crimes, and so on, and how now have come to a way of living that we all will miss if it goes away. And the alternatives on offer are not very attractive. So I hope I'm not diverting the discussion. My answer is it's very dangerous, and that's why we need to redefine or reassert the meaning of Western civilization, which is neither that it's white supremacism and Christianity only, nor that there is no such thing. And the borders, well, I mean, I wish borders, I'm a migrant. I cannot say migration is a bad thing. We'll never say that. Meanwhile, you cannot have open borders just out of ideological purity or just because it's a good thing in theory. So integrating people, building a project where you take in people that will learn the language, will learn the history, learn the culture, and of course influence it and redefine it commonly with those who were there slowly, by all means. So I'm not saying everybody should become Anglo-Saxon, whatever, follow all the myths of the 12th century or whatever. The history of the country obviously develops, and the migrants are part of it. But the idea that you have to never teach British history or American history because it's tainted with horrible things, that's exactly why you have to teach it, because people learn from the mistakes, learn from the civil wars, learn from what went wrong, but also learn from the brave people who fought against these injustices within those societies as well as from without. So a more historical and nuanced attitude to our history seems to me urgent. Otherwise, yeah, the two extremes are heading towards a self-reinforcing clash.
And I mean, I've worked in the Middle East, and there you have a situation in which in several countries, to some extent, perhaps in all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, you have two radically different ideas of what constitutes the civilization of the state. I mean, what ought to be the dominant civilization. And that makes working democracy very, very difficult, because, as has often been said, democracy and procedural justice are very good at gaining a consensus behind the legitimacy of decisions on secondary issues. But the idea that the entire civilization of the state can change from one election to another is, I mean, not really viable.
Yes, you're reminding me, last week I was teaching Thomas Hobbes. Why is Thomas Hobbes so important? Not because of necessarily of his answer, but of his question. How would it be if we lived in the state of nature where we have a right to do whatever we like? Hell, because everybody else has a right to do whatever they like. There has to be somebody who makes finally some decisions, and people may have to establish some rules. And then remember, of course, as I told my students last week, first year students, don't be depressed. There are other solutions. There are people who come and say the sovereign doesn't have to be absolute. But that we need that artificial artificial person of the state to keep us together, and that we need some glue, that we need some rules that cannot change every time a majority changes or every time somebody is more vociferous than others, because usually these things are done by vociferous minorities, not necessarily even by conscious majorities. Yes, that's absolutely important, and therefore that's why tradition, history, certain rules that continue the conversation according to established rules and some glue that keeps the society together is very important, and it should not be negotiable, because if it's negotiable, then it's the state of nature every time people disagree.
Well, another way of understanding Hobbes, or what Hobbes would probably have said in this context, is that a state can't change between Catholicism and Protestantism with every change of monarch. That this is a recipe for catastrophe, as indeed it proved in England. But I mean, historically speaking, until recently, I think it's fair to say that really diverse states were mostly imperial states, with an authority, therefore, that was permanent and separate from the diverse society. And that also means, at least in their process of growth and stability, it meant very self-confident states with a very strong sense of their own identity and of state loyalty. And you could, I think, say that about the West as well. I don't just mean the imperial or former imperial states like Britain and France, but even states like Sweden that really felt themselves to be, representing the future of humanity in their version of society. If that collapses, whether for objective reasons or because some of the intellectual forces that you've described on both sides are attacking that, is that I mean, how do we survive this as democracies?
Well, I agree with the premise, if I understand it correctly, that large empires were by definition multi-ethnic. Very often the elites were not ethnically of the majority. The Ottomans notoriously would employ Greeks and Armenians and all sorts of people in very important positions, and they didn't have to be ethnically Turkish. That applies to empires, yes. That was the warning of Lord Acton in the 19th century about nationality. He was saying, if you start defining the state as purely national and you want to completely nationalize the state as if it's an ethnic thing, then of course, depending on their humanity, they will either expel or convert forcefully or kill all the minorities. So that was the warning. So defining nations, nation states or whatever we want to call them, because nation state is an aspiration. There is no such thing unless you're in a tiny island. The state tries to persuade its population that they are one nation in order to have that glue that they need. Defining it in a way that is not ethnic, that is not religious, that is not restrictive, but rather related to, inspired by a narrative, by a story, by an aspiration, is the only way to keep them going, but also to keep them in some kind of internal peace. That's why one of the most remarkable documents is a little essay, lecture in 1882, I think, by Ernest Renan, Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? What is a nation? It's often been repeated. Benedict Anderson wrote two different versions of it in his two editions of the book. In the second edition, he wrote, I had taken it at face value. Now I realize it's even more remarkable than I thought because of what is implied between the lines, that people have to remember their divisions, that they have to remember what they are supposed to have forgotten. They have to remember what happens if you go to civil war. So, and the whole argument there was against the German version of a nation which is ethnic or organic or based on language. And he was saying, c'est la volonté de tous les jours, le plébiscite de tous les jours, excuse me, the everyday plebiscite, the will to be together based on common projects and common memories, which very often are painful memories. So I suspect unless we have to remember that, we have to remember that our societies are fragile, that's why I mentioned Hobbes. It's very important to remember exactly these dangers. It's all very well to think rationally, logically, this doesn't make sense. Societies are not, history and politics are messy things. They are not logical constructions. That's why political theory is not enough. You need to always remember what happens if. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I
But
like premise.
Renan also, of course, said that to become a nation, peoples have to forget a great deal. This is something that I've sometimes, quoted to the left. On the one hand, you have to remember history, but if you dwell constantly on past crimes and internal crimes against each other or against what has become each other, then, well, I mean, as in any relationship almost, this is also a recipe for disaster.
Yes, because as he rightly says, and as everybody who has looked at any history knows, every society was built on violence and conquest initially. Once they have the luxury, and if we look at Machiavelli, how he proceeds from the prince to the discourses, how he more or less tells you you need somebody to impose order with ruthless means. If you can afford it, the best regime is a republic where many people and many characters participate and they enjoy liberty and participation and so on. So unless we remember that, yes, there is no way we can coexist. So all societies are based on very unpleasant things, all of them. My attempt always in these discussions is as compared to which society. When I'm told about all sorts of things that have been horrible in the history of the West, obviously there are terrible things in the history of the West, but compared to which society which never had slavery or never had violence or never had somebody imposing their will or taxation on the non-believers and not on the believers or whatever. So as long as we remember that, of course we should try to improve our societies, but the ideological purity that is based on some ideal utopian society that we are not is not a good recipe for how to deal with the present.
When it comes to the designation of others, but also, of course, of terrible crimes on both sides, the Christian Muslim one is pretty old. And now, of course, we see determined attempts to revive that, more in Europe, I think, on the right than in America, but you see it here as well. And of course, this relates also to the question of how do you define Israel as part of the West? Well, one way of doing that is basically to say, well, as Netanyahu now says, Israel represents Western civilization. What it means is we are against the Muslims, and that's basically what he means. How deep a problem and how great a threat do you think this is, and how do we get beyond it?
Yes, there are people who will immediately criticize what I say. I do not pretend to be a theologian who understands the meaning of Islam. There are people who will not agree with this. But obviously, I hope that I'm right in thinking that the Muslim people I know, my students and my colleagues and so on, like me, are humans, very complex people who want to get on with their lives. I know many, many Muslims concentrated in Albania and Bosnia and have had relations with some of them. And I know that they are not different from me and they are not intent in imposing some theocratic Sharia law on Europe. I am sure and aware, and many of them are worried, that people from other parts of the world with their own agendas and a lot of money try to persuade them that they are not welcome in Europe, that they are not part of the West, that they are hated. And of course, the rhetoric of some political parties in Europe and America doesn't help because that narrative becomes more and more plausible. So we come back to the earlier problem of if we let extremes feed on each other, they become self-fulfilling prophecies, unfortunately. yes, we should remember that there has been terrible violence between Muslims and Christians, as there has been between, as you said, the Western Christians on their way to the holy places. Instead of liberating the holy places, conquered Constantinople and looted it and took all the treasures of their fellow Christians to various churches and palaces and so on. If we dwell on these things too much and we notice nothing else, and nothing else matters in history, we should all fight each other non-stop. Hopefully we don't. Hopefully we will not. That's why I keep saying balanced, nuanced attempts to understand history, read history, but not just selectively. So that's why I'm surprised and happy to have found Auguste Comte as the person who literally wrote more about the West as a history and as a project for the future than anybody else, not just before, but also since. Nobody has written as much. Not Toynbee, not Spengler. And Comte wanted to build a religion of humanity that would be inclusive of religious personalities and prophets and philosophers and benefactors of humanity from all parts of the world. So he would include he included Muhammad, Buddha, and so on. So, and he was dreaming of a humanity that would move its spiritual capital to Constantinople, the city between Europe and Asia, eventually from Paris, where it would initially be in the first stages. So there is something there that is an attempt already in the very inception of the West to say this can become more than Christian, has to become more than Christian, has to become more than French and Latin and German and so on. Obviously, Comte was a utopian, but it's an interesting thing that the inception of the West was not to justify empire, as most of my colleagues will tell you, but rather Comte was obsessively anti-imperialist. He wanted to abolish any violence and empires. So we could build a different narrative, hopefully, and a different future.
Well, for me, I mean, one of the disastrous things after the end of the Cold War was that, I mean, as it had been, but unnecessarily, in my view, the idea of the West and of all the political ideas associated with the West became completely bound up with American geopolitical or imperial agendas, which made it much more difficult for people in other societies to swallow this.
Yes. Yes.
A question
May I?
Yes.
And that makes my book again hopefully relevant and useful, because it insists on America joined the West in the late 19th century and wholeheartedly during the First World War, not before. The West is not necessarily Anglo-America and its offshoots. It's a much bigger and longer history. Sorry.
And by the way, you know, the origins of this Anglo-American ideology in the 1890s, the English-speaking Union, Churchill, Conan Doyle, Kipling, and so forth. At that time, Britain was trying to draw America into an alliance against France and Russia. Of course, 20 years later, America ended up fighting Germany together with France and, well, Russia for a bit. So, yes, I mean, the endless shifts. We have a question from the audience, which, of course, a great many people have raised, which is constitutional patriotism, Habermas's idea, which you quote, is it enough to hold a society together, or do there need to be deeper, more visceral identities and allegiances?
Very good. Brilliant. I think I have an answer, because it's a brilliant idea. Depends on what you mean by constitutional. Of course, constitutional patriotism is better than self-consciously ethnic, racist nationalism, in the sense only if I think you share my genes do I relate with you. But in the way people think, the way societies are kept together, you need a bit more, and therefore you need a narrative of a culture. But as I said, you need a narrative a la in the version of Ernest Renan, which was always a shared narrative, a shared story among people who he says explicitly no, they are not of the same origin. The French are of Germanic of Celtic and of Roman origin, and of course, much else in between since then. But for as long as they have a project together. So if by constitutional we mean strictly adherence to the law and institutions, no. But if by constitutional patriotism we mean a broader political culture to which you attach yourself and believe this project suits me and we have to defend it and so on, it becomes a cultural narrative, which is probably preferable than a cultural narrative based on some religion that most people don't share, either because they have given up being religious or because they come from different religions, or some ethnic narrative that is patently a myth, and sooner or later people realize that. I mean, the idea that any population beyond a tiny island somewhere in some remote ocean is not mixed up is for the dogs. So for the birds, sorry. How many people believe that they really have common origins in any nation of the size of Britain, France, America? I would really be interested to know.
Mhm. Yes, I mean, the famous, much mocked French school formula, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors, the Gauls, and this operating in schools in French Africa and Indochina and so forth. But of course, if you understand that as a cultural legacy within the school concerned, it has a rather different cast.
Yes, absolutely. As long as it's not literal, and of course, that's why my answer to the question is constitutional patriotism is not enough. It has to be a cultural project which involves the institutions and a broader culture which people identify with, even if they came from somewhere else. In the same way as I identify with an awful lot of British cultural achievements and political thought and so on, although I come from somewhere else very, very clearly. I hope it's doable because that's the way to keep societies together. So a core, a culture, a tradition in a country cannot be just dismissed because parts of it are not palatable and there was conflict and there was injustice in the past. There has been injustice everywhere.
A final question. Sorry, but we could talk about it for the next 6 hours or more. But is that kind of cultural core and tradition holding people together still possible in the era of the social media and AI and mass television? Or in fact, is the whole of modern capitalist society sort of progressively destroying these traditions?
That is where I cannot pretend to have an answer. I am as anxious as you or more. Um, let's hope we find a way to regulate these things. Let's find a way to reassert. Yes, the biggest problem is I keep telling my students when we read a tradition, where we read a thinker, I remind them they had read the one we did last week. They had read the one we read the week before. Try to imagine a world where people read the same books, and try to imagine a world even a few decades ago when I was growing up where people watched the same television news and read the same newspapers. It's good if they are not only one or two, it's good if they are 12 or 15, but there was one agora, there was one forum, there was one conversation. If we lose the capacity to have a common conversation, either because of social media or because of excessive multicultural separatism and tribalism, or both, yes, we are in deep trouble, and we go back to chaos, and therefore Hobbes' state of nature. If we can't talk and if we don't mean the same things by the same words, the things that Hannah Arendt was very worried already in the 50s, people must understand what they mean when they talk. Otherwise, yeah, this is the biggest, perhaps the biggest of the problems we discussed. Let's hope we find a way to regulate them and stop them from complete misinformation or complete fragmentation. Let's hope there is some way of coming back to some common conversations on some things.
Because although he didn't use that word, as Tocqueville warned, complete individualism leads, or is likely to lead in the end, to totalitarianism,
Yeah,
as a state pulls things back together by imposing, by ruthless force, one version
Yeah.
of what is.
If you have only individuals who are not associated in any way, the state is very happy to take on more and more powers and say, don't worry, go and make money and enjoy your money with your family and friends. I'll do it. And people let it do it, and then they realize, they forget that there was a time when they made any decisions or thought any different thoughts to the ones that now they are told the majority thinks. Yeah, as you say, we were warned long ago by Tocqueville and others.
We were warned. Well, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation. We could go on talking about these things for, well, we will go on talking about them for
I hope so.
days and years. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you soon, I hope.